The night I decided to die was the same night I discovered my husband had buried someone in our backyard 17 years earlier. Let that sink in for a moment. 17 years. That's how long I had been sleeping 30 feet away from a grave I never knew existed. That's how long I had been kissing a man goodnight whose hands had done something so terrible, so unspeakable, that when I finally learned the truth, I couldn't tell which revelation destroyed me more, what he had done, or how completely he had fooled me. My name is Patricia Carnahan, and in the winter of 1979, I was a 43-year-old woman standing at the edge of everything I thought I knew, watching it crumble into dust. But before you judge me, before you assume you know where this story is going, I need you to understand something. The woman I was in January of that year and the woman I became by December were two entirely different people. One of them was a victim. The other was something else entirely. If you're watching this right now, I need you to promise me something. Don't scroll away. Don't click to the next video. Because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that will change the way you look at the person sleeping next to you tonight. It will make you question every smile, every gentle touch, every whispered, "I love you," you've ever received. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. You should be uncomfortable. Because comfort is just another word for blindness, and I was blind for far too long. Before you continue, if this story already has you leaning closer to your screen, if your heart is beating just a little faster, then do me a favor. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel. Because the truth deserves witnesses, and I've waited 45 years to finally tell mine. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Not to that frozen January night in 1979, but further back, to the summer of 1955, when I first met Harold Carnahan at a church social in Millbrook, Ohio. I was 19 years old, fresh out of secretarial school, wearing a yellow dress my mother had sewn from curtain fabric because we couldn't afford store-bought clothes. My father had died in a factory accident when I was 12, leaving my mother to raise 4 children on a seamstress's salary. By the time I was old enough to work, I understood one fundamental truth about the world. Security was everything. Love was a luxury. Survival was the goal. Harold was 26, already established as a junior partner at his father's insurance firm. He had broad shoulders, kind eyes, and a smile that made the other girls at the social whisper behind their hands. When he asked me to dance, I thought there had been some mistake. Men like Harold Carnahan didn't notice girls like Patricia Doyle. We were invisible, background noise, the ones who poured punch and cleaned up after the party ended. But Harold noticed me. He said it was the way I laughed, full and unashamed, when his cousin told a joke. He said most girls at those socials were performing, trying to seem demure and proper, but I had laughed like I actually meant it. That was the first lie I believed, that Harold Carnahan was different, that he could see the real me, that he valued authenticity. We married in the spring of 1956. I was 20 years old, younger than my own daughter would be when she made the same mistake I did. The wedding was small, held in the same church where we'd met, and as I walked down that aisle toward Harold's waiting smile, I remember thinking that my life of struggle was finally over. I had escaped poverty. I had found safety. I had won. Our house was a modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street, the kind of home I had only ever seen from the outside while walking to my mother's clients' houses to deliver their mended clothes. It had a wraparound porch, a detached garage, and a backyard that stretched toward a small creek that marked the property line. Harold was so proud of that backyard. He spent every weekend out there, planting roses, building a gazebo with his own hands, creating what he called our little paradise. I should have noticed, shouldn't I? The way he guarded that space. The way he insisted on doing all the gardening himself, never letting me, or, later, our children help with the digging. The way certain patches of ground remained untouched for years, marked only by the roses he planted in perfect rows. But I didn't notice. I was too busy being grateful, too busy playing the role of the good wife, the lucky woman who had married up, the girl from the wrong side of town who had somehow landed in a house with indoor plumbing and a husband who came home every night. We had 3 children in the first 5 years. Richard in 1957, Elizabeth in 1959, and Michael in 1961. They were beautiful babies, all of them taking after Harold with their dark hair and gray eyes. I used to joke that I had carried them for 9 months each, and they had the audacity to look nothing like me. Harold would laugh and say it was because they knew which parent was the better-looking one. Another lie, wrapped in humor, designed to keep me small. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Those early years were good, or at least I convinced myself they were. Harold worked long hours at the insurance firm, eventually taking over when his father retired in 1963. I kept the house, raised the children, and slowly forgot that I had ever wanted anything more than this. Before Harold, I had dreamed of being a writer. I used to fill notebooks with stories, poems, thoughts that felt too big for my small life. After Harold, I filled grocery lists and ironing schedules. The children grew. Richard became a serious boy, too much like his father for my comfort. Elizabeth was my dreamer, my wild child, the one who reminded me of who I used to be before I learned to shrink myself. Michael was the baby, the peacemaker, the one who could sense tension in a room before anyone spoke a word. By 1962, the year that would change everything without my knowledge, I had settled into a comfortable numbness. I didn't know then that while I was hanging laundry in the backyard, something was buried beneath my feet that would one day rise up and demand to be seen. I didn't know that my husband, the man I trusted with my life, had done something so monstrous that even now, after all these years, I struggle to find the words. But the dead have a way of refusing to stay buried. And in the winter of 1979, the past came calling, demanding payment for sins I didn't even know existed. The first sign came on January 3rd, the day after my 43rd birthday. A letter arrived, addressed to Harold, but with no return address. Just his name, typed on a plain white envelope, and inside, a single photograph that would begin the unraveling of my entire world. Harold's hands trembled when he opened that envelope. I watched from the kitchen doorway, coffee pot in hand, as his face drained of all color. In 23 years of marriage, I had never seen my husband look frightened. Angry, yes. Frustrated, certainly. But never frightened. Fear was not an emotion Harold Carnahan allowed himself to display. When he noticed me watching, his expression shifted so quickly I almost doubted what I had seen. He folded the photograph back into the envelope, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and smiled that same smile he had given me at the church social all those years ago. Just a prank, he said. Some kids from the office playing a joke. I believed him. Of course I believed him. I had spent over 2 decades training myself to believe Harold Carnahan, even when his words made no sense, even when my instincts screamed that something was wrong. Believing Harold was easier than questioning him. Questioning him led to arguments, and arguments led to the silent treatment, and the silent treatment led to weeks of tension that made the children walk on eggshells. So I poured his coffee, kissed his cheek, and pretended that the fear I had witnessed was nothing more than my imagination. But something changed after that letter. Harold began coming home later than usual, claiming extra work at the office. He installed a lock on his study door, something he had never done before. He started sleeping poorly, tossing and turning so violently that I moved to the guest room just to get some rest. When I asked what was wrong, he snapped at me, told me I was being nosy, reminded me that his business was his own. The Harold Carnahan of 1979 was not the man I had married. That man had been charming, attentive, eager to please. This man was a stranger wearing my husband's face, and with each passing day, the mask slipped further. It was Elizabeth who first suggested that I search his study. She was 20 years old then, home from college for winter break, sharp and observant in ways that I had never been at her age. We were washing dishes together one evening when she asked, point blank, if I had ever considered that her father might be hiding something. I dropped a glass. It shattered in the sink, and as I picked up the pieces, cutting my finger on a shard, I told her that was a terrible thing to suggest about her own father. But later that night, lying alone in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself the question I had been avoiding for weeks. What was Harold Carnahan afraid of? The answer came 3 weeks later, on January 24th, when Harold left for what he claimed was a business trip to Columbus. I watched his car disappear down Maple Street, waited 30 minutes to make sure he wouldn't return for something forgotten, and then I picked the lock on his study door with a hairpin. I had never done anything like that before. 23 years of marriage, and I had never once violated my husband's privacy. But I was no longer the obedient wife I had been trained to be. Something had shifted inside me, some dormant part of myself that had been sleeping since before I walked down that church aisle. Patricia Doyle, the girl who used to write stories in secret notebooks, had finally woken up. Harold's study was meticulously organized, every file folder labeled, every book aligned perfectly on the shelves. The man was nothing if not precise. I searched his desk drawers first, finding nothing but insurance documents and tax returns. I checked behind the books on the shelves, under the carpet, inside the false bottom of the antique cigar box he kept on his desk. Nothing. 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 I was about to give up when I noticed the photograph on his desk had been moved. It was a family portrait from 1965, all of us posed stiffly in our Sunday best. But the frame seemed thicker than I remembered. I picked it up, turned it over, and felt my heart stop. Taped to the back of the frame was a key. Small, brass, old-fashioned. The kind of key that might open a safety deposit box, or a locked drawer in a desk I hadn't thought to check. The drawer was hidden beneath a false panel in Harold's desk. Inside, I found the envelope that had arrived on January 3rd, along with 3 more that had come since. Each one contained a photograph. Each photograph showed the same thing. A girl. Young, perhaps 17 or 18. Dark hair, pale skin, eyes that seemed to stare directly at me through the black and white image. She was standing in front of our house. Our house. The colonial on Maple Street with its wraparound porch and detached garage. She was smiling in the first photograph, looking uncertain in the second, and in the third. In the third, she wasn't smiling at all. She was looking at something off camera with an expression I recognized. Fear. The same fear I had seen on Harold's face when he opened that first envelope. Beneath the photographs were letters, typed and signed, each one more threatening than the last. I know what you did. She deserved better. The roses won't hide it forever. 17 years is long enough. Time to pay. I read those words again and again, trying to make sense of them. Who was this girl? What had Harold done? And what did the roses have to do with any of it? The roses. Harold's roses. The ones he had planted in the backyard in the summer of 1962, the same summer that photograph of the smiling girl had been taken. The roses that bloomed every spring in perfect rows, covering a patch of ground that Harold had always insisted was too rocky for anything else. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Harold was many things, cold, controlling, increasingly distant, but he wasn't capable of what those letters were suggesting. No one I knew was capable of that. These were the things that happened in movies, in crime novels, in places far away from Millbrook, Ohio. But the girl in the photograph was real. Her fear was real. And the roses were real too, blooming season after season over soil that had remained undisturbed for 17 years. I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I locked the study door. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine, then another, then a third. By the time Harold returned from Columbus 2 days later, I had convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But here is where I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you keep watching. If you were in my shoes, if you had found what I found, what would you have done? Would you have confronted your husband immediately, demanded the truth, risked everything for answers that might destroy your entire world? Or would you have done what I did? Buried your suspicions, played the good wife for just a little longer, told yourself that ignorance was easier than truth? I want to know your answer. Leave it in the comments below. Tell me what you would have done. Because looking back now, I wonder if things might have ended differently if I had been braver sooner. If I had trusted my instincts instead of my husband. If I had remembered that the girl I used to be, the one who filled notebooks with stories, had never been afraid of the truth. But I was afraid. And that fear cost me everything. February arrived with a blizzard that trapped us all inside for a week. Harold was irritable, pacing the house like a caged animal, jumping every time the phone rang. The children noticed. Even Richard, who had always idolized his father, began keeping his distance. Only Michael, sweet Michael, tried to lighten the mood with jokes and board games that no one wanted to play. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, another letter arrived. This one wasn't addressed to Harold. It was addressed to me. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, alone in the kitchen while Harold was at work and the house stood empty. The children had all returned to their lives. Richard to his law practice in Cleveland, Elizabeth to her dormitory at Ohio State, Michael to his senior year of high school, where he spent most of his time avoiding coming home. The letter inside was typed, just like the others, but the message was entirely different. Mrs. Carnahan, your husband is not who you think he is. In the summer of 1962, a young woman named Marie Wallace disappeared from Millbrook. She was last seen at your home. She never left. If you want to know where she is, look where the roses grow. If you want to know the truth, meet me at the Millbrook Public Library, Thursday at 2 p.m. Come alone. Tell no one. Your husband least of all. Marie Wallace. I read the name again and again, trying to place it, searching my memory for any recollection of a girl by that name. But 1962 was 17 years ago. I had been 26, consumed by the demands of 3 young children, rarely leaving the house except for grocery shopping and church on Sundays. The library was a 20-minute walk from our house, a red brick building on the corner of Main Street that I had visited hundreds of times over the years. It was a public place, safe, filled with people. Whatever this person wanted to tell me, hearing them out couldn't hurt. And despite every instinct telling me to show the letter to Harold, to demand answers from my own husband instead of a stranger, I knew that Harold would never tell me the truth. He had been lying to me for 17 years. Why would he stop now? Thursday came faster than I expected. I told Harold I was visiting a friend for lunch, a lie that slipped off my tongue with surprising ease. I was learning that deception was a muscle, and after decades of disuse, mine was growing stronger by the day. The library was quiet when I arrived, populated only by a few elderly patrons browsing the periodicals section and a young mother wrestling with a toddler near the children's books. I chose a table near the back, facing the entrance, and waited. At exactly 2:07 p.m., she walked in. I recognized her immediately, though I couldn't have explained how. She was in her 60s, thin and frail, with white hair pulled back in a severe bun. She walked with a cane, each step measured and deliberate. But her eyes were the same ones I had seen in the photographs. Older, wearier, but unmistakably the same. She sat across from me without asking permission. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph I hadn't seen before. It showed 2 girls, teenagers, standing arm in arm in front of a house I didn't recognize. One of them was the girl from Harold's hidden photographs. The other was younger, perhaps 14 or 15, with the same dark hair and pale complexion. I'm Dorothy Wallace, she said. Marie was my sister. The name hit me like a physical blow. Marie Wallace. The girl who had disappeared in 1962. The girl who had last been seen at my house. The girl who, according to the letters, never left. I don't understand, I managed. Why are you contacting me now? Why after all these years? Dorothy's eyes hardened. Because for 17 years, I believed she had run away. That's what everyone said. That's what the police concluded. Rose was wild, they said. Unpredictable. She had talked about going to California, about escaping this small town and making something of herself. When she vanished, everyone assumed she had finally done it. But you didn't believe that. I did at first. I was young, barely in high school. I wanted to believe my sister was alive somewhere, happy, free. I wrote letters to every address I could think of in California, hoping one of them would find her. None of them did. Dorothy paused, and I watched her gather herself, wrestling with emotions that had clearly been building for nearly 2 decades. Last year, I was diagnosed with cancer. Terminal. The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky. And suddenly, all those questions I had buried came rushing back. I couldn't die without knowing what really happened to Rose. So you hired someone to investigate? I didn't have to. I had spent my whole adult life collecting information, following leads, tracking down everyone who had known my sister in the months before she disappeared. And every trail, every single one, led back to the same place. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Your husband. The library seemed to spin around me. I gripped the edge of the table, fighting the urge to run, to scream, to deny everything this dying woman was suggesting. Rose worked as a secretary at your husband's insurance firm in the spring of 1962, Dorothy continued. She was 18, just out of high school, saving money for college. She was brilliant, Patricia, smarter than anyone in our family. She had dreams of becoming a lawyer, of fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Dorothy pulled out another photograph. This one showed Rose Marie in a smart business dress, standing in front of a building I recognized immediately. Carnahan Insurance. Harold's firm. She wrote me letters that summer. Told me about her boss, about how charming he was, how different from the other men she had met. She said he understood her, saw her potential, treated her like she was special. I closed my eyes, recognizing the pattern. The same words I might have used to describe Harold when I first met him. The same trap, baited with kindness and set with intent. Then the letters stopped. July 15th, 1962, was the last time I ever heard from my sister. The police found nothing. No body, no evidence of foul play, no witnesses who saw her leave town. She simply vanished, like she had never existed at all. But you think Harold. I don't think. I know. Dorothy reached into her purse again, pulling out a yellowed piece of paper. I found this in Rose's room, hidden under a loose floorboard. She had written it the day before she disappeared. I took the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was young, hopeful, full of the loops and flourishes of a girl who still believed the world was beautiful. Tonight, I'm going to tell him. He deserves to know about the baby. I think he'll be happy. I think maybe he'll leave her for me. Either way, everything changes tomorrow. Wish me luck. The baby. Rose Marie Wallace had been pregnant when she disappeared. Pregnant with my husband's child. I felt the room tilt, my vision narrowing to a single point. Somewhere in the distance, I heard Dorothy calling my name, but the sound was muffled, underwater, coming from a place I could no longer reach. When I came to, I was lying on a library couch, Dorothy standing over me with a glass of water. The librarian was hovering nearby, asking if she should call an ambulance. I told her no. Told her I was fine. Told her I just needed a moment. But I wasn't fine. I would never be fine again. Dorothy helped me sit up, pressed the water into my hands, and waited with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose. There's more, she said quietly. Things I haven't told you yet. Things about that night, about your house, about what happened when Rose went there to tell Harold the truth. I wanted to cover my ears. I wanted to run out of the library and keep running until I found somewhere Harold Carnahan had never touched, never corrupted, never destroyed. But I had asked for the truth, and now I had to hear it. All of it. Rose called me from your house that night. July 15th, around 9 p.m. She was crying. She said Harold had reacted badly to her news, that there had been an argument, that she was afraid. She said she was going to leave, going to walk to the bus station and take the first bus anywhere. Dorothy's voice cracked. That was the last time I ever heard her voice. The last time anyone did. I walked home from the library in a daze, Dorothy's words echoing in my mind with every step. Rose Marie Wallace, 18 years old, pregnant, afraid, called from my house at 9 p.m. on July 15th, 1962, and then nothing. No bus ticket purchased in her name. No sightings along the route to the station. No trace of her ever leaving Millbrook at all. I thought about that night in 1962, trying to remember where I had been, what I had been doing while my husband was doing something unthinkable 30 feet from where I slept. The children would have been in bed by 9 p.m. Richard was 5, Elizabeth was 3, Michael was barely 1. I had been exhausted that summer, running on fumes, desperate for any moment of peace. Had Harold asked me to take a sleeping pill that night? Had he insisted I go to bed early, claiming he had work to do in his study? I couldn't remember. 17 years of ordinary days had blurred together, obscuring the one night that mattered most. When I reached our house on Maple Street, I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, staring at it with new eyes. The wraparound porch, the detached garage, the backyard stretching toward the creek. It was the same house I had lived in for 23 years, but everything about it looked different now. The white paint seemed less pristine, more like a fresh coat of whitewash covering something rotten underneath. The windows, which I had always thought looked warm and welcoming, now seemed like eyes, watching, judging, keeping secrets. And the roses. God help me, the roses. They were dormant now, brown stems poking through the February snow, but I could see them in my mind's eye as they bloomed every spring. Red roses, planted in perfect rows, tended obsessively by a man who claimed to love beauty, but who had buried something monstrous beneath them. I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I walked around to the backyard, my boots crunching through the frozen snow, and I stood at the edge of Harold's rose garden. The ground was hard as stone, frozen solid by weeks of bitter cold. Even if I had wanted to dig, I couldn't have broken through. But spring would come. The snow would melt. The ground would soften. And when it did, I would finally learn the truth that had been sleeping beneath my feet for 17 years. Harold came home at 6 o'clock, the same time he always did. I had prepared dinner, set the table, poured his evening scotch. All the rituals of our marriage, performed with the precision of an actress who had been playing the same role for far too long. He seemed surprised by my attentiveness, even grateful. He kissed my cheek, complimented the roast, asked about my day with what passed for genuine interest. I told him I had visited the library, read some magazines. Nothing special. He nodded, satisfied, and we ate in the silence that had become the soundtrack of our marriage. Two strangers sitting across from each other, pretending to be a family, each hiding secrets that could destroy the other. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, listening to Harold's footsteps as he paced the master bedroom above me. He hadn't slept well in weeks. Whatever demons were chasing him were getting closer, and soon, very soon, they would catch him. But not yet. I needed more information. I needed to understand exactly what had happened that night in 1962 before I confronted him. Because if I was wrong, if Dorothy Wallace was mistaken, if this was all some elaborate misunderstanding, then I would destroy my marriage for nothing. And despite everything, despite the suspicions and the fear and the growing certainty that my husband was a monster, I still couldn't quite let go of the life I had built. It was a cage, yes, but it was the only home I knew. The next morning, I returned to the library. Dorothy was waiting for me, as I had known she would be. We had exchanged phone numbers before parting, but neither of us had needed to call. We both understood that there was more to discuss, more pieces of this puzzle to fit together. This time, Dorothy brought documents. Police reports from 1962, obtained through channels she didn't explain. Witness statements from Rose's co-workers at the insurance firm. A map of Millbrook with Rose's last known movements marked in red ink. We spread them across a library table and studied them like archaeologists examining ancient ruins. The police had interviewed Harold in the days after Rose's disappearance. According to the report, he had been cooperative, concerned, believable. He admitted that Rose had worked for him, that she had been a talented secretary with a bright future. He claimed not to know why she had left town so suddenly, suggested that perhaps she had gotten a better offer somewhere else. The officer who conducted the interview noted that Mr. Carnahan seemed genuinely puzzled by the young woman's disappearance and had offered to assist in any way he could. Case closed. No further investigation required. They never searched your property, Dorothy said, pointing to a paragraph I had already read 3 times. Never even asked to look around. Harold was a respected businessman, a family man, a pillar of the community. The idea that he might be involved never crossed their minds. He was charming, I said, the word tasting like poison. He's always been charming. It's his greatest weapon. Was there nothing? Dorothy pressed. No sign of what he had done. No strange behavior. No unexplained absences. I thought back to that summer. The summer of 1962. Harold had been 32, at the peak of his confidence, recently promoted to senior partner after his father's retirement. He had been working long hours, often not coming home until after midnight. I had assumed it was the demands of his new position. Now I wondered what other demands he had been meeting. He planted the roses that August, I said slowly, the memory surfacing like a body from deep water. I remember because he did it himself. Wouldn't let me help. Said he wanted to surprise me, to create something beautiful for the family. I thought it was romantic. Dorothy's face went pale. August 1962, 1 month after Rose disappeared. We sat in silence, the weight of that coincidence pressing down on us both. What do we do now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dorothy reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong for a dying woman. We get justice, she said. For Rose. For her baby. For the life she never got to live. And we make sure Harold Carnahan never hurts anyone again. The plan we developed was simple in theory, terrifying in execution. We would gather evidence. We would document everything. And when the ground thawed, we would dig. March arrived with a false spring, warm days that melted the snow and promised an early bloom. Harold seemed to sense the change in the air, or perhaps he sensed the change in me. He became solicitous, almost tender, bringing me flowers and suggesting weekend trips we never took. But his eyes never lost that hunted look, and his pacing at night only grew more frantic. More letters arrived, 3 in March alone, each one more specific than the last. The anonymous sender knew details that only someone close to the situation could know. They knew about the rose garden. They knew about the specific night Rose had called Dorothy. They knew about the baby. Harold burned the letters in the fireplace, but not before I had photographed each one with the Polaroid camera I had hidden in my purse. Dorothy and I were building a case, piece by piece, preparing for the day when we would finally expose the truth. But first, I needed to protect my children. Richard was the hardest to approach. At 22, he had become a younger version of his father, ambitious, driven, utterly convinced of his own judgment. When I called him in Cleveland and suggested we meet for lunch, he seemed surprised but agreed. We met at a restaurant halfway between our homes, a neutral ground where I could speak freely. I didn't tell him everything. I couldn't. But I told him enough, that his father and I were having difficulties, that I was considering leaving, that I needed him to trust me even if he didn't understand. Richard listened with the patience of a lawyer hearing a client's confession, asked careful questions about my evidence, and finally said the words I had been dreading. Mom, I love you, but this sounds crazy. Dad has his faults, but the things you're suggesting, it's not possible. There has to be another explanation. I wanted to scream at him, wanted to shake him until he understood that the father he idolized was a stranger, a mask, a beautiful lie that had fooled us all. But I couldn't. Richard wasn't ready to hear the truth. He might never be. Elizabeth was different. When I visited her at Ohio State, she listened to my carefully edited version of events with growing horror. Unlike her brother, Elizabeth had always sensed the darkness beneath her father's charm. She had been fighting against his control for years, choosing a college he disapproved of, dating men he hated, building a life as far from Maple Street as she could manage. I knew it, she said when I finished. I always knew something was wrong with him. The way he looked at me sometimes, like I was property instead of a person. The way he had to control everything. What we wore, what we said, who we talked to. You believe me? Of course I believe you. She took my hands, her young face fierce with determination. What do you need me to do? I told her to stay at school, to finish her semester, to wait for my signal. If things went wrong, if Harold discovered what I was planning, I needed to know she was safe, beyond his reach. Michael was the child I worried about most. At 17, he was still living at home, still subject to his father's moods and manipulations. I couldn't tell him anything directly. He was too young, too honest, too likely to accidentally reveal what he knew. But I began laying the groundwork for his escape, researching summer programs in other states, applying to colleges on his behalf, creating options for a future away from Maple Street. By April, the ground had finally thawed. The rose garden softened, ready to receive the spade I had hidden in the garage. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof that would hold up in court, that would convince a jury of Harold Carnahan's guilt, that would ensure he never escaped justice. The proof came on April 17th from an unexpected source. I was cleaning Harold's study, a task I had volunteered for specifically so I could search it more thoroughly. When I found the journal, it was hidden behind a false panel in his closet, bound in leather, filled with his precise handwriting. I recognized it immediately as something I had never seen before, something Harold had kept secret throughout our entire marriage. With trembling hands, I began to read. The journal started in 1960, 2 years before Rose's disappearance. The early entries were mundane: business dealings, social obligations, observations about colleagues and competitors. But in March of 1962, the tone changed. Hired a new secretary today, Rose Wallace, 18 years old, fresh out of high school, eager to please. Reminds me of Patricia when I first met her, young, hungry, willing to believe anything a man tells her. This could be useful. I felt sick reading those words, seeing my own courtship reflected in his calculated pursuit of another woman. But I forced myself to continue. The entries that followed documented Harold's affair with Rose in clinical detail. The gifts he gave her, the lies he told, the way he convinced her that he loved her, that he would leave his wife for her, that they would build a life together. And then, in July, Rose claims she's pregnant. Says the baby is mine. I told her that's impossible, that I had a vasectomy years ago, that she must have been with someone else. She didn't believe me. Said she would tell Patricia, tell my clients, tell everyone in town. I can't let that happen. Everything I've built, my reputation, my family, my legacy, would be destroyed. I won't let a foolish girl ruin me. Not now. Not ever. The entry for July 15th was the longest in the journal. Rose came to the house tonight. Patricia was asleep. I made sure of that, put something in her tea. The children were in bed. Rose was crying, threatening, saying she would go to the police if I didn't do the right thing. The right thing. As if she has any idea what that means. She doesn't understand that some people are more valuable than others, that some lives matter more, that sacrifices must be made for the greater good. I did what had to be done. The garden will hide what remains. In time, no one will remember a secretary who ran away to California. No one will remember Marie Wallace at all. I closed the journal, fighting the urge to vomit. There it was. His confession, written in his own hand, hidden in his own closet, waiting for 17 years to be discovered. I had everything I needed. The following days were a blur of secret meetings and whispered phone calls. Dorothy and I met with a lawyer she had found, a woman named Margaret Chun who specialized in cases other attorneys refused to touch. Margaret reviewed the evidence we had gathered, the photographs, the letters, the journal, and confirmed what I had been hoping and dreading in equal measure. This is enough for an arrest, she said. Maybe even enough for a conviction, though a good defense attorney will try to claim the journal was coerced or fabricated. What we really need is physical evidence. The body. Marie Wallace, lying in the cold ground beneath Harold's roses for 17 years. Waiting to be found. Waiting to finally go home. We developed a plan. Margaret would contact the police, present our evidence, and request a search warrant for our property. Dorothy and I would be present when the digging began, witnesses to the moment when Harold's carefully constructed world came crashing down around him. But Harold, as always, was one step ahead. He came home early on April 23rd, his face pale, his hands shaking. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, pretending nothing was wrong. He walked past me without a word, went straight to his study, and emerged minutes later with the leather journal in his hands. Did you think I wouldn't notice? His voice was calm, but his eyes were wild, dangerous. Did you think you could go through my things without me knowing? I felt the blood drain from my face. Harold, I don't know what you're. Don't lie to me. He threw the journal on the kitchen table, and I watched his pages scattered across the surface. You read it. You know everything. And now you're going to tell me exactly who else knows. I should have been frightened. Any sane woman would have been terrified, alone in a house with a man who had already killed once and clearly had nothing left to lose. But something strange happened in that moment. Instead of fear, I felt something else rising inside me. Something hot and sharp and long overdue. Rage. Yes, I read it. I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I read every disgusting word. I know about Rose. I know about the baby. I know about what you buried in the backyard while I was sleeping upstairs, drugged on whatever you put in my tea. Harold's face contorted with fury. You have no idea what you're talking about. Rose was a mistake, a complication that had to be eliminated. She would have destroyed everything. My career, my family, my standing in this community. I did what had to be done. You murdered a pregnant teenager and buried her in our garden. I protected what was mine. He advanced on me, and I backed against the counter, my hand closing around the handle of a kitchen knife without conscious thought. Everything I did for this family. For you. For our children. You should be thanking me instead of thanking you. I laughed, and the sound was harsh, broken, nothing like the full laugh that had attracted Harold all those years ago at the church social. You killed an innocent girl and lied to me for 17 years. You destroyed Dorothy Wallace's life. You destroyed Rose's entire family. And you want me to thank you? Harold stopped, something shifting in his expression. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain. Dorothy Wallace? You've been talking to Dorothy Wallace. I've been doing more than talking. The police will be here within the hour. Margaret Chun, my lawyer, is bringing them a search warrant. They're going to dig up your rose garden. Harold, they're going to find Rose. And they're going to put you away for the rest of your miserable life. For a moment, I thought he would attack me. His body tensed, his hands curled into fists, and I saw the same darkness in his eyes that Rose must have seen in her final moments. I tightened my grip on the knife, prepared to fight for my life if necessary. But Harold Carnahan, for all his cruelty, was a coward at heart. He had killed Rose because she was young and trusting and alone. He had hidden her body because he was too afraid to face the consequences. And now, faced with a woman who was no longer young, no longer trusting, and very much not alone, he did what cowards always do. He ran. I heard the front door slam, heard his car roar to life in the driveway, heard the squeal of tires as he fled down Maple Street. I didn't try to stop him. Let him run. Let him think he could escape. The police would find him eventually. Men like Harold Carnahan always thought they were smarter than everyone else. It never occurred to them that their own arrogance would be their undoing. 20 minutes later, Margaret Chin arrived with 2 police officers and a search warrant. Dorothy was with them, leaning heavily on her cane but refusing to miss this moment. We stood together at the edge of the rose garden as the officers began to dig. It didn't take long. The ground was soft from weeks of spring rain, and Harold had never buried Rose very deep. Within an hour, they had uncovered the first bones. Dorothy collapsed against me, sobbing. 17 years of grief, 17 years of not knowing, 17 years of wondering. All of it released in a flood of tears that soaked my shoulder. I held her as tightly as I could, whispering words of comfort that felt utterly inadequate. They found Marie Wallace's remains scattered beneath the roses, along with a locket that Dorothy identified as a gift from their mother. The medical examiner would later confirm that Rose had been pregnant at the time of her death, just as she had claimed. She had been 18 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, and Harold Carnahan had taken it all because she dared to demand that he do the right thing. Harold himself was arrested that evening, apprehended at a motel 50 miles outside of Millbrook, where he had stopped to gather his thoughts and planned his next move. He offered no resistance when the officers arrived. By then, I think, he understood that it was finally over. The mask had slipped, and there was no putting it back on. The trial of Harold Carnahan began in September of 1979 and lasted for 6 weeks. It was the most sensational criminal case in Millbrook's history, drawing reporters from across the state and beyond. Every detail of Harold's double life was exposed, examined, and dissected in open court. I testified against him. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, sitting in that witness box while Harold's defense attorney tried to paint me as a bitter wife seeking revenge. But I held firm. I told the truth about our marriage, about the letters, about the journal, about the night I finally decided to stop being blind. Dorothy testified too, though her health was failing rapidly. She described her sister's final phone call, the years of searching, the agony of not knowing. By the time she finished, half the jury was in tears. The prosecution presented the physical evidence. Rose's remains, the locket, DNA evidence that conclusively proved Harold was the father of her unborn child. They presented his journal, reading the damning passages aloud while Harold sat stone-faced at the defense table. They presented witness after witness who testified to Harold's controlling behavior, his manipulation, his carefully constructed facade of respectability. The defense tried everything. They argued that the journal was a fabrication, that I had planted it to frame my husband. They suggested that Rose had been killed by someone else and her body moved to our property without Harold's knowledge. They painted Rose as an unstable young woman who had lied about the pregnancy to trap a successful man. None of it worked. On October 15, 1979, the jury found Harold Carnahan guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I was sitting in the courtroom when the verdict was read. So was Dorothy, though by then she was confined to a wheelchair, her body ravaged by the cancer that would claim her life just 3 months later. When the foreman pronounced the word guilty, Dorothy reached for my hand and squeezed it with what little strength she had left. "Thank you," she whispered. "Rose can finally rest." After the trial, I sold the house on Maple Street. I couldn't bear to live there anymore, knowing what lay beneath the roses. A developer bought the property and tore down the Colonial, building 3 modest townhouses in its place. The rose garden was paved over, turned into a parking lot, as if that could erase the horror of what had happened there. But some things can't be erased. Some things leave marks that no amount of concrete can cover. I moved to a small apartment in Columbus, close to Elizabeth, who had finished her degree and started working as a social worker. Richard never forgave me for what I had done to his father. He cut off all contact after the trial, refusing to acknowledge that the man he had idolized was capable of such monstrous acts. I heard years later that he had changed his name, moved to the West Coast, and pretended that he had no family at all. Michael, my youngest, was the one who surprised me most. He had been 17 when his father was arrested, old enough to understand what had happened, but young enough to still be shaped by it. Instead of running from the truth, he embraced it. He became a victim's advocate, dedicating his life to helping families of the missing find the closure that had been denied to the Wallaces for so long. Dorothy lived just long enough to see Harold convicted. She died in January of 1980, peacefully, in a hospice surrounded by the photographs of her sister that she had collected over the years. I was with her at the end, holding her hand as she took her final breath. Her last words were Rose's name, spoken with the tenderness of a sister who had never stopped loving, never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. I scattered her ashes at the cemetery where Rose was finally laid to rest. They had buried Rose with a proper headstone, the first marker of her existence that Millbrook had ever acknowledged. It read, Rose Marie Wallace, 1944 to 1962. Beloved daughter, sister, and mother. May she finally find peace. Standing at that grave, I understood something that had eluded me throughout my marriage, throughout my years of willful blindness, throughout all the compromises I had made in the name of security and comfort. Peace doesn't come from safety. It comes from truth. It comes from the courage to see what is really in front of you, even when it terrifies you. It comes from refusing to be complicit in lies, even lies that protect the ones you love. I had been Patricia Carnahan for 23 years. I had worn that name like a shield, thinking it protected me from the chaos of the world. But the name had been a prison, and the shield had been a blindfold. The moment I took them off, the moment I allowed myself to see, I became someone new. Not Patricia Carnahan, the loyal wife. Not Patricia Doyle, the desperate girl. Just Patricia, a woman who had finally learned that strength isn't about endurance. It's about knowing when to stop enduring. The years that followed were not easy, but they were mine. For the first time in my adult life, I belonged to no one but myself. I made my own decisions, set my own schedule, lived according to my own values instead of someone else's expectations. I started writing again. The notebooks I had abandoned when I married Harold came back to life, filled with stories that had been waiting decades to be told. I wrote about women like me, women who had lost themselves in marriages that promised safety and delivered prisons. Women who had to learn, slowly and painfully, that they were stronger than they had ever been allowed to believe. My first book was published in 1985. It was a novel, loosely based on my experience, about a woman who discovers her husband's terrible secret and must choose between comfortable ignorance and devastating truth. The critics called it unflinching and brutally honest. It became a bestseller, translated into a dozen languages, taught in college courses about women's literature and the female experience. I wrote 3 more books after that, each one exploring different facets of what it means to be a woman in a world designed by men. I received letters from readers who saw themselves in my characters, who told me that my words had given them the courage to leave bad relationships, to demand better for themselves, to stop accepting crumbs when they deserved the whole loaf. Elizabeth married in 1987, a kind man who had none of her father's charm, but all of his apparent virtues. They had 2 children, my grandchildren, who knew nothing of Harold Carnahan except that their grandfather had been a bad man who did a bad thing a long time ago. That was enough truth for them. The details could wait until they were older, if they ever needed to know it all. Michael remained close throughout my remaining years. He visited every Sunday, bringing groceries and stories about his work with victims' families. Watching him grow into the man his father had never been was one of the great joys of my life. Some cycles can be broken. Some legacies can be rewritten. Richard remained a wound that never fully healed. I wrote him letters every year on his birthday, letters he never answered. I kept hoping he would one day understand that I had saved our family by exposing his father, not destroyed it. But some children can never see past the pedestal they've placed their parents on. Some truths are too heavy to carry. Harold died in prison in 2003, 24 years after his conviction. I received a letter from the warden informing me of his passing, asking if I wanted to claim the body. I didn't respond. Let him be buried in the prison cemetery, unmarked and unmourned. Let him spend eternity among strangers, just as Rose had spent 17 years in an unmarked grave beneath his roses. I am 89 years old now. My hands shake when I hold a pen, and the words don't come as easily as they once did. But I wanted to tell this story one more time, properly, before I go to wherever we go when we leave this world. Because here is what I learned, standing in that library 45 years ago, holding a photograph of a girl who never got to grow old. We are all responsible for the truths we choose to see. Every time we look away, every time we tell ourselves it's not our business, every time we prioritize comfort over justice, we become complicit in the darkness that follows. I was complicit for 17 years. I let Harold Carnahan hide his sins in plain sight, beneath a garden that I admired every spring. I accepted his lies because the truth was too frightening to contemplate. I traded my instincts for security, and the price of that trade was Marie Wallace's unmarked grave. But I also learned that it's never too late to choose differently. That the woman I was at 43, broken and afraid, and standing on the edge of everything she thought she knew, had more strength in her than she ever imagined. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite it. Marie Wallace was 18 when she died. She never got to finish college, never got to become the lawyer she dreamed of being, never got to hold her baby in her arms. Harold Carnahan took all of that from her, and no verdict could ever bring it back. But we gave her something else. We gave her truth. We gave her name back to the world. We made sure that she would be remembered not as a secretary who ran away to California, but as a young woman who deserved better than what she got. Sometimes, that's all we can do. Sometimes, justice isn't about fixing what was broken. It's about making sure it never happens again. My name is Patricia, and this has been my story. A story of love and betrayal, of blindness and sight, of the graves we dig with our silence, and the ones we uncover when we finally decide to speak. If you've listened this far, thank you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Remember Marie Wallace. Remember Dorothy, who never stopped searching. And remember me, not as a victim, but as a woman who finally found her voice. The roses don't grow on Maple Street anymore, but truth does. And truth, unlike roses, never dies. This is Patricia. This was 1979. And this, finally, is the end.